Hello everyone, welcome to .NET Core Central, the website for everything .NET Core. Today I'm going to focus on unit testing using XUnit framework. For more information on unit testing and XUnit, you can head over to my blog. I have some valuable resources out there. But in a nutshell, unit testing is testing of a particular unit of work without having to have any dependency on external resources. And unit testing to me is extremely important because it helps a project being agile, and it also helps figuring out issues way earlier in the process rather than getting into QA and production environment. For that, I'm going to start with create a new project, and I'm going to select XUnit as the project type, and I'm going to name it as time management.unit test. In my next video, I'll cover more on integration test. For this one, I'm just going to focus on unit test. Let me just rebuild so that the red squiggly goes away. Now for unit testing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new business layer for my project. So for that, I'm going to go add new project. It's going to be a class library. So time management dot booking. This particular class library is going to just focus on booking of time. Let me rename this one to time booking processor for the time being. We'll think about the name in future, and I'm going to make this as an interface. And it would have one method which will be book time, and it is going to take the employee object again. For that, first I have to add a dependency on the data. And the next one would be the date time. It's essentially the date of the booking, and the last time is going to be the duration. And let me add the namespace, and here we go. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have an implementation class for this interface. I'm going to go ahead and create a time booking processor. Let me make it as public, and I'm going to implement time booking processor, implement the interface. I'm not going to do any database operation through the time management.data. I'm just going to focus on some input validation. So the first validation I'm going to do is I'm going to check if the employee ID is less than or equal to 0, and if it is, then I'm going to throw an argument exception because the employee ID has to be greater than 0. So first thing is employee.id is less than or equal to 0, then throw new argument exception and give a message employee ID cannot be less than 0. The second validation I'm going to have is on date. I want to make sure that the employees cannot enter a timesheet for a future date. That's my requirement. So for that, I'm going to create another if condition and say if date dot date is greater than date time dot today, then throw new argument exception, or I can actually here say argument out of range exception because I want it to be less than today's date, so you're getting out of range. Same thing for employee ID also, it should be argument out of range because we are getting out of range of what is expected by the system. So booking date cannot be greater than today. It's a descriptive enough message. And the last thing I'm going to do is I want to make sure just to not encourage employees working beyond the 9-hour time, I'm going to say duration cannot be greater than 9 hours. Here the exception would be, again this is out of range exception, I'm going to say you are working too hard, let's talk. So these are the 3 validation method only for the time being, and I'm not doing any data processing right now. We'll cover that as well. So let me go back to my unit testing project, and here what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this class here. Let's just rename here and name it as time booking processor unit test. Let's keep that name. Okay, now first thing I'm going to do is validate employee ID. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to validate the ID of the employee. For that, first thing I have to do is I have to create an instance of time booking processor. Now the reason I am not able to get it is, first thing I have to add the reference to booking, and second thing I have to add the appropriate namespaces. So now the reds quickly would be gone. The next thing I'm doing is I'm going to do an assert. So what is my expectation? My expectation is if I call the time booking processor with an employee ID of 0 or less than 0, I should be getting an argument out of range exception. So I'm going to do assert dot throws argument out of range exception, and this is it's an action, so I'm just going to go with when I do time booking processor dot book time, and I'm passing here new of employee without any employee ID. So by default, since it's an integer property, by default it will be 0, and then I'm going to just do date time dot today, and the duration I'm just going to pass some valid duration, though it doesn't matter because the first thing in our code is the employee ID check, so it will anyway trigger the first. Okay, so if I do that, validate, let me change the name, validate, instead of that I'm going to say test invalid employee ID. That's a better name. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the test. So I'm going to go here and just going to run all tests and let the XUnit framework do the testing for me. As we can see, the project is building. The test discovery started, and we can see the testing is completed and it's green. So our test has passed. We tested the employee ID. Now next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pass a valid employee ID but a future date, and it should also result in a argument out of exception. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this invalid date And here in the new employee, I'm going to provide id is equal to 2, which is a valid, and date time equal to today dot add days of 1. This should result in the same argument out of range exception. So I'm just going to click on this one and I'm going to run tests. As you can see, my second test is also green, the test invalid date. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pass a invalid duration. So here the date time is going to be today. That's our valid date time, and here I'm going to say 10 hours, working too hard. So in that case, again, I'm just going to test this function. So now you can see the invalid duration test is also a pass. Now the next thing we want to make sure is that if we pass all valid condition, we do not get any exception, right? That's one of our criteria. I'm going to name it as valid arguments. And I'm going to pass it as 9 hours. Now here's the thing. This test is going to fail because it's not going to throw every argument is right. So it's not going to throw any exception. But since our book time method is a void, now as you can see, this test failed, which is expected. We expect it to fail because it is not going to throw any exception at this point in time. Now here's the thing, this is extremely hard to test book time because its return type is void. So that is why in my previous video, if you have not seen it yet, you should see it, where I was mentioning that for every function there is two way we can go, especially the functions which do modify the state and does not return anything, is we can go with void, in which case we bubble up all exceptions, or we can go with a boolean to return the success and failure. So for unit testing purposes, from my experience, it becomes extremely easy to return response from every function instead of a void. Now if you have a better way of doing this, please comment in my video so that I can also understand different way of doing this. But so far for me, returning a boolean worked really well for unit testing as well as a feedback from a function. Otherwise void does not give you any feedback. So I'm going to change this to boolean, and also I'm going to go back and change this one to boolean as well, and here I'm just going to return true because so far I'm mostly throwing exception, so I'm going to return true. Now I'm going to go back to my unit testing function. So here instead of throws, I'm going to change this as true, and I'm going to just make it as book time. And now if we run the test again, we should be a pass here as well. So run selected test, and as you can see, my test is now a success. In my experience, returning a boolean from a function which is modifying a state is extremely helpful, both from testing point of view as well as giving feedback to the end user who is using your API. So especially if this is an API and it is used across different teams, or you are creating an open source project, giving a boolean, to me it helps a lot. As soon as you look into the contract, you are expecting something. Because with void, it's hard to say what's going on inside, like whether it's going to work, it's going to throw an exception, what if exception is been eaten, is it a success case, you don't know. But that's my thought process. Please free to comment on what you think about this, and we can definitely discuss. So the next thing I'm going to do is, now in my time booking processor, this is the time when I want to add something into the database. And this is very important and critical because I want to show here that how important mocking becomes when we are dealing with external I/O. And in unit testing, the first principle is unit testing can be done anywhere, even your network completely unplugged, which means no dependency on any external resources. So for that, what I'm going to do first is in my data, I'm just going to create an interface. And this also shows you how powerful it becomes using interfaces and dependency injection for testing purposes. So I'm going to create an interface booking processor because it's going to save, and my previous convention has been processor for edit, add and delete, so I'm going to keep the same. So here I'm going to do a similar method, and for the booking processor also I'm going to start with bool as a return type so that I get a feedback, and just like my other processor I'm going to create similar name. So I'm going to name it as create, and it is going to take the here, because it's just a database insert, we are not doing any logic. In my database table also I'm going to create a foreign key with employee, so here I'm just going to take the employee ID, though I have not created my table yet, and I'm going to explain why. Employee ID, next thing is date, and the last one is duration. Okay, here I'm not going to create any implementation of this interface. I'm just going to keep it as an interface, and that is why also I am not creating the table, because it's not needed for my unit testing purposes. When I go ahead and start doing a full-fledged integration test running the application, that time yes. Here what I'm going to do first thing is to create a constructor, and in the constructor I'm going to expect I booking processor, and I have to add, so it has to be built. What's going on is not a public interface. So that's the problem. We go back here, and now I just create a field booking processor, and now I'm ready to use it. So booking processor dot create employee dot id, then date, and then duration. So this is going to directly return. So this is going to return whether it's a success or failure, and I'm going to get rid of this redundant return statement. Now at this point I go back to my test and I have to fix this error. So for these, what I need to do is I need to create a mock. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a NuGet package for mock. I go to manage NuGet package, I'm going to go to browse, and I'm going to search for MOQ, and I'm going to install the mock. Okay, accept. MOQ is installed, so I'm going to go back to my test project, and I'm going to say var booking processor equal to new mock of I booking processor. So there are a couple of things I have to do. First, I have to add the namespace for MOQ. The second thing I have to do is I have to add the dependency to the data DLL as well. So now I know what is the booking processor, and here all I'm going to do is booking processor dot object. So these two lines, it's going to be pretty much same for all of these. So now I'm going to run the test project. The first three will be successful, the last one will be a failure. And why it will be a failure? Because inside of the book time I am calling the iBooking processor book method, which is going to return a boolean, and by default the boolean returns are false. So it's going to, since I am not telling what to return, it's just going to return false, and my last one will be a failure. So let's just try it out. Run all test, and as expected the last test is a failure. The objective for our test is to make sure our input validation is successful at this point in time, and in future if we have any logic, that logic has worked successfully, not necessarily if the database update is success or a failure. That's not the task of this unit. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say when booking processor dot setup, and I'm going to say processor goes to processor dot, why it is saying so, it's because of processor dot create, and I'm going to say with any parameter. So for that I'd say dot e dot is any, right, any of employee, that's my sorry, it's not employee, it's going to be employee ID. So any of int, then the next one is e dot is any of date time, which means I am not worried about what is the parameter passed, though I can easily pick them up from here because I know I am passing to today and 9. But in cases where we don't know what the parameters are, let's say if it is set internally based on some logic, it's always a good idea to pass it any. But for this purpose we could have easily passed to datetime.today and 9, and I'm going to try out both. So right now I'm going to do again e dot is any of int, and then I'm going to say if it's passed this way, then dot, oh, it's a decimal. I'm going to do dot return and true. So I'm saying essentially that return true when this function create is called with any parameters, right? And then I'm going to go back to test. Let me just rerun this test because this is the only one we have changed, and that's it. The test is passed, we can see. Now just to show that I could have passed 2 and datetime dot today 9, it'll still work. I'm going to just change this, save it, and just rerun this test. We can see this is also successful. Now I'm going to change this parameter to 10, and now there will be a parameter mismatch, so this will not be executed and it will return the default false, and this will fail. So I'm going to try that out again. And remember the subtle difference. The difference is not because I am passing an invalid argument and it is returning a argument out of range exception. Now I am saying during mocking that the create supports only a duration of 10, which means if a duration of 10 is not passed into the create method, the mocking framework is not going to be executing this line. Instead it's going to return the default output, which is a false for a boolean. And we can verify that if I look into the test fail, and the reason will be the expected was true but actual was false. That's the case. Okay, now I'm going to revert everything back into is any, and I'm going to rerun the test, and we can see the test has successfully run. This is all I wanted to cover for today. In next video, I'm going to start implementing the integration test of the ASP.NET Core Web API, and I'm going to pick up the employee controller and do the integration testing on employee controller, and we'll use XUnit for that. Thanks so much for watching this video. Please leave your comment and suggestions if you want me to cover something else, or if you want me to go a little bit deeper on some of the example of XUnit and ASP.NET Core. And please do not forget to subscribe my channel.